You think you know the gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Athena, Ra, Osiris. You've heard these names 1,000 times. They're in movies, in books, in our culture. But here's what most people don't realize: these are not the real gods. These are the famous gods, the ones that survived, the ones that made it into mainstream history. But here's the truth. For every god you know, there are dozens you've never heard of. Gods that were worshipped by millions. Gods that shaped entire civilizations. Gods that were so powerful, so important, that their erasure from history is almost criminal. Today we're uncovering the forgotten gods, the deities that history forgot, that scholars overlook, and that completely change how we understand ancient religion, power, and human civilization itself. Here's the problem with how we learn about ancient gods. We learn about them through a filter. We learn about the gods that made it into surviving texts. We learn about the gods that Greek and Roman historians decided to write about. We learn about the gods that fit into neat mythological narratives. But that's not how ancient religion actually worked. Ancient people didn't worship just one pantheon. They worshipped local gods, regional gods, gods that were specific to their tribe, their city, their valley. Most of these gods were never written down. Or if they were, the texts were lost, destroyed, or deliberately suppressed. Think about it: we have thousands of ancient texts, but we only have fragments. We have pottery shards, we have inscriptions on tomb walls, we have references in texts about other gods. But we're missing the vast majority of what ancient peoples actually believed. And here's what's even more interesting: many of these forgotten gods reveal patterns that the famous gods don't. They show us how ordinary people worshipped. They show us the religious concerns of common folk, not just kings and priests. They show us religions that were more complex, more nuanced, more human than we typically imagine. So today we're going to explore forgotten gods from around the world. We're going to ask, why were they forgotten? What did they represent? What can they teach us about the true nature of ancient belief systems? Let's start with Greece. We know about the 12 Olympians: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, and either Dionysus or Hestia depending on which version of the myth you're reading. These are the gods everyone knows. But Greece was full of other gods. Hundreds of them. Some were older than the Olympians, some were local deities that never made it into the Olympian system. Let me introduce you to Hecate. You might have heard of her in passing. She's mentioned in some Greek myths as a goddess of magic and crossroads. But most people don't know that Hecate was one of the most powerful and widely worshipped goddesses in ancient Greece. She had temples, she had mystery cults, she had priests and priestesses dedicated to her worship. Hecate was originally a titan. She kept her power even after Zeus and the Olympians took over. This was unusual. Most titans were defeated or imprisoned. But Hecate was so respected, so feared, that Zeus allowed her to keep her authority. She ruled the crossroads, she governed magic, she was the guardian of thresholds between worlds. People prayed to Hecate for protection. They left her food offerings at intersections, they invoked her name in magical rituals. She was essential to Greek religious life. But in modern times, most people have never heard of her. Why? Because she didn't have a major role in the most famous Greek myths. She wasn't part of the dramatic love stories or the epic battles that made it into literature and modern retellings. Then there's Hebe, the goddess of youth. She was the daughter of Zeus and Hera. She served as the cupbearer to the gods, bringing them ambrosia and nectar. She had shrines, she had followers. But she's barely mentioned in modern Greek mythology retellings. Why? Because she wasn't dramatic enough. She didn't have tragic love affairs, she wasn't involved in major conflicts. So she faded from popular memory. What about Nike, the goddess of victory? You know her name, it's a shoe brand. But do you know who she actually was? Nike was worshipped across Greece as the goddess who granted victory in battle and in competition. Athletes prayed to her, soldiers invoked her name before battle. She was incredibly important to Greek culture. But because she wasn't one of the 12 Olympians, she got relegated to minor status. Here's a lesser-known one, Aeolus, the keeper of the winds. In Homer's Odyssey, Aeolus is described as a god who keeps the winds imprisoned in bags, he controls them, he releases them. But Aeolus faded into obscurity. He became a minor character in a story rather than a worshipped deity. And then there's Morpheus, god of dreams. While Morpheus shows up in modern movies and stories, most people don't realize he was an actual worshipped deity in ancient Greece. People built shrines to him, they prayed to him for good dreams, for protection from nightmares, for visions. But his worship was so personal, so individual, that he never became a major public god. What's fascinating about these forgotten Greek gods is that they often represented aspects of life that were deeply important to ordinary people. Youth, victory, dreams, magic, protection, these weren't abstract concepts. These were things people cared about. But because these gods didn't have epic myths attached to them, they were forgotten. Now let's go to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. We think of Mesopotamian religion as being about gods like Marduk, Enlil, Enki. These are the gods that survived in texts. But Mesopotamia had thousands of years of history, and the gods changed, evolved, and sometimes were literally erased. Let me tell you about Tiamat. Tiamat was one of the oldest and most powerful beings in Mesopotamian cosmology. She wasn't always called a god, she was called a primordial being, a chaos serpent, the mother of all things. She existed before the world was created. In the earliest Mesopotamian texts, Tiamat was revered, feared, respected. But then something happened, a new priesthood rose to power. Marduk, a younger god from Babylon, became politically important. And the priests rewrote the mythology. In the Enuma Elish, the creation myth, Tiamat is portrayed as a monster that needs to be defeated. Marduk defeats her and creates the world from her body. This is a complete inversion of her previous status. Why? Because Mesopotamia was conquered and reconquered multiple times. Each conquest brought new rulers, new priests, new gods. And the old gods either had to be incorporated into the new system or erased. Tiamat wasn't erased completely, she's still mentioned in texts. But her meaning was completely reversed. From a primordial mother to a chaos monster. Then there's Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. She was incredibly important in Mesopotamian belief. People prayed to her, they feared her, she had absolute power over the realm of the dead. But because her domain was the underworld, she wasn't celebrated in the same way as sky gods or water gods. So she faded from popular knowledge. What about Ninhursag? She was the mother goddess, the earth mother, incredibly important in early Sumerian religion. She was worshipped as the creator of life, the nurturer, the protector of mothers and children. But as Mesopotamian religion evolved and centralized, male gods became more prominent. Ninhursag's worship declined, she became a minor figure in the pantheon. Here's one that's really interesting, Namtar, a demon or messenger god associated with plague and death. Namtar would be sent by the gods to punish humans, people feared Namtar, they made offerings to Namtar to protect themselves. But Namtar represented something uncomfortable, divine punishment, suffering, plague. So as religion became more systematized, Namtar's role was minimized. The pattern in Mesopotamia is clear: gods were forgotten when they didn't serve the interests of whoever held power. Male gods rose to prominence, sky gods were elevated above earth gods, gods associated with order were preferred over gods associated with chaos or liminal spaces. This wasn't organic forgetting. This was deliberate theological revision to support political power structures. Egypt has one of the longest continuous civilizations in human history. 3,000 years of recorded history. You'd think they'd remember their gods, right? But Egypt actually had massive religious upheavals that caused certain gods to be forgotten or suppressed. Let's start with Atum. Atum was one of the oldest Egyptian gods. He was the creator god. He created himself. He existed before anything else. But over time, as Egypt's religious center moved and political power shifted, Atum was merged with Ra to become Atum-Ra. Eventually, Ra became so dominant that Atum's independent worship faded. Then there's Sekhmet. You might know her as a fierce goddess, a lion-headed warrior. But what many people don't realize is how important and terrifying she was. Sekhmet was the goddess of plague, the goddess of divine punishment, the eye of Ra, the instrument of the sun god's wrath. People were absolutely terrified of her. But because she represented disease and death, she wasn't celebrated in the same way as benevolent goddesses like Hathor. What about Nut? Nut was the sky goddess, the mother of all celestial bodies. She was essential to Egyptian cosmology. The Egyptians literally saw her every night. The stars in the sky were Nut's body. She was depicted as an arched woman spanning across the heavens. But in popular understanding, she's been overshadowed by Ra and other more famous deities. Here's one that's fascinating: Shu. Shu was the god of air, of the space between things. He separated the sky from the earth. He represented order and light. But air is invisible. It's hard to visualize. It's hard to build a religion around something you can't see. So Shu became more abstract, more philosophical, less worshipped by common people. Then there's the case of Akhenaten's religious revolution. We talked about this in a previous video, but it bears repeating here. Akhenaten tried to eliminate the worship of Ammonius and replace it with worship of the Aten, the sun disk. This was revolutionary. It meant that all the priests and temples dedicated to Ammonius lost their power and funding. When Akhenaten died, his successors reversed his reforms. They erased his memory. They tried to destroy records of his reign. And for centuries, Akhenaten and his Aten worship were completely forgotten. Only modern archaeology rediscovered them. But here's what's important: there were other gods that Akhenaten tried to suppress. These gods didn't come back. They were lost. We only know about them because of inscriptions that survived. These were gods that ordinary Egyptians worshipped: local gods, household gods, gods of specific professions. When the state stopped supporting their temples, when priests stopped recording their myths, they disappeared from history. The pattern in Egypt is similar to Mesopotamia. Political power determines which gods are remembered. Gods associated with state authority, with the reigning pharaoh, with the capital city, these gods were remembered. Local gods, household gods, gods associated with previous dynasties, these were forgotten. Now let's go to India. Hinduism is one of the oldest living religions. It has an enormous pantheon, thousands of gods, hundreds of major deities. But even with thousands of gods, many have been forgotten or transformed beyond recognition. Let me introduce you to Aditi. In the earliest Vedic texts, Aditi was one of the most important goddesses. She was the infinite, the boundless, the mother of the Adithias, the divine beings. She was fundamental to Vedic cosmology. But as Hinduism evolved, as new gods came into prominence, a deity faded. Today, most Hindu practitioners have never heard of her. Why? Because she was associated with the Vedic period, which is ancient history. Modern Hinduism is more focused on later deities like Shiva, Vishnu, and the various avatars. Then there's Ushas, the goddess of dawn. In the Vedas, Ushas is described in beautiful, poetic terms. She brings light, she awakens the world, she was worshipped and revered. But she was incredibly gentle, not dramatic. She didn't have epic battles or tragic love stories. So she faded from prominence. What about Djaushpita, the Sky Father? In the earliest Vedic texts, Djaushpita was one of the supreme gods, similar to Zeus or Indra. He represented the sky, the father principle, divine authority. But over time, he was overshadowed by Indra and eventually by Shiva and Vishnu. Today, most Hindu practitioners don't even know who Djaushpita is. Here's one that's really interesting, Ahriman. Ahriman was one of the Adithyas, and he represented hospitality, protection, and the sun. He had specific rituals associated with him. But these rituals faded, and Ahriman became a name rather than a worshipped deity. People know the name from ancient texts, but they don't worship him or pray to him. Then there's the case of Rudra, who you might think is just another name for Shiva, but Rudra was originally a separate deity. He was a god of storms, of wildness, of destruction. He was feared. He was powerful. But when Shiva rose to prominence, Rudra was incorporated into Shiva's identity. Rudra became an aspect of Shiva rather than an independent god. The original Rudra worship was absorbed and transformed. What's fascinating about Hindu religion is that it didn't erase its old gods, instead, it transformed them. It incorporated them into newer systems. It made them aspects of more prominent deities. This is actually more respectful than outright erasure, but the result is the same: the original gods are forgotten. Their unique identities are lost, they become footnotes in the mythology of more powerful deities. In Egyptian mythology, there's a god called Thoth who's often remembered, but there's another god called Khepri, the scarab beetle god who represents transformation and regeneration. Khepri was worshipped, he had temples, but he's barely known today. In Norse mythology, we know about Odin, Thor, Freya, but what about Vidar, the god of silence and vengeance? Or Vali, a god born specifically to avenge Baldr's death? These are part of the Norse pantheon, but they're not prominent in modern retellings. In Chinese mythology, there are thousands of gods and spirits. But most Westerners only know about a handful. What about Guan Gong, the god of war and righteousness? Or Mazu, the goddess of the sea? These are incredibly important in Chinese religious practice, but they're unknown in Western culture. In Islamic tradition, before Islam, Arabia had hundreds of local gods and goddesses. There was Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manet, three goddesses who were worshipped across Arabian tribes. When Islam came and monotheism was established, these gods were completely erased from the religious landscape. Muslims were taught to view these gods as false idols. But they were deeply important to pre-Islamic Arabs. Their erasure represented the cultural conquest of Arabia. In Mesoamerica, we know about the Aztec gods because the Spanish conquistadors documented them. But what about the gods of the peoples who came before the Aztecs? The gods of the Olmec, the classic Maya, the Toltecs? Most of their gods are completely lost to us. We only know fragments. We find images on pottery and in carvings, but we don't know their names or what they represented. The pattern is universal: gods are forgotten when their worshippers lose power. Gods are forgotten when the culture that worshipped them is conquered or absorbed. Gods are forgotten when they don't fit into newer religious systems. Gods are forgotten when they're not dramatic or important enough to make it into the surviving texts. So here's what we've learned: gods are forgotten for specific reasons. First, political power determines memory. The gods of the ruling class are remembered. The gods of conquered peoples are erased. When a new empire takes over, the old gods often disappear from official records. Second, writing determines survival. Gods that made it into written texts are more likely to survive. Gods that were only preserved through oral tradition, through ritual practice, through folk memory, these are vulnerable to being lost. If the people who remembered them are killed or scattered, those gods vanish. Third, dramatic narratives matter. Gods with big myths, with epic stories, with romantic entanglements, these gods are more likely to be remembered and retold. Gods associated with mundane things, household protection, weather, fertility, these are more likely to be forgotten. Fourth, religious consolidation. As religions grow larger and more centralized, local gods are incorporated into bigger systems or pushed out entirely. Monotheistic religions, by definition, have to deal with previously polytheistic beliefs. The solution is often to erase the old gods. Fifth, archaeology is random. We remember gods whose texts survived, whose temples left archaeological traces, whose names were inscribed on durable materials. We forget gods whose worship was more personal, more domestic, less monumental. So here's the real question: what does the existence of forgotten gods tell us about religion, history, and truth? It tells us that our understanding of the past is incomplete. It tells us that we see only the gods who survived, not the gods that actually existed. It tells us that history is written by the winners, and religious history is no exception. It also tells us something deeper: the gods that survived are not necessarily the most important gods, they're the gods that were important to the people who controlled writing, who built monuments, who had political power. The forgotten gods might have been equally or more important to ordinary people. They might have been central to everyday religious practice. But because they didn't make it into official texts, we forgot them. What do you think? Does knowing about forgotten gods change how you understand religion and history? Do you think there are modern parallels, beliefs and practices that are being erased or forgotten from our own culture? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to keep exploring hidden history and forgotten knowledge, subscribe. Next week we're diving into biblical mysteries nobody talks about, secrets hidden in scripture that the church doesn't want you to know. Thanks for watching.